Wall Street's billionaires are currently flooding into the Bitcoin space, but when they get here, they could be faced with a serious dilemma. Today, there's only 2.3 million Bitcoin sitting on exchanges, and if you look out around the world, there's over 2,000 billionaires and 50,000 public companies who are going to need some sort of Bitcoin exposure in the future. So today, we're going to be analyzing why I believe that less than 0.01% of all of these entities will be able to accumulate more Bitcoin than Michael Saylor. And speaking of Michael Saylor, we're also going to be analyzing why he could hold more Bitcoin than over 150 countries. And we're also going to be looking at whether or not Michael Saylor could accumulate 1% of the total Bitcoin supply and whether he's going to leave any Bitcoin left for his billionaire buddies. So before we begin crunching the maths behind this billionaire Bitcoin conundrum and highlighting which billionaires have been quietly accumulating Bitcoin in very large sums, I want to first look at the significance of Michael Saylor's most recent Bitcoin buy and have a look at what kind of effect it is going to have on the overall market. So Michael Saylor sent shockwaves through the Bitcoin space last month when he came out and announced that he had spent another $600 million accumulating another 6,000 odd Bitcoin in the month of November. So what's most significant about Michael Saylor's most recent buy in November was the fact that it was his biggest buy since early 2021. Saylor took to Twitter to announce that he'd actually bought nearly 600 million additional dollars worth of Bitcoin, which pushed MicroStrategy's total Bitcoin stack up over 170,000 coins. Now that is a pretty important number because it is getting closer and closer to that 210,000 Bitcoin milestone. At that amount, if MicroStrategy were to get there, Michael Saylor will hold 1% of the total Bitcoin supply. But I think this most recent buy in November is more noteworthy because of its size, okay? He bought 16,000 Bitcoin, and if you look at the past 4 months in the bear market, the previous 4 months of this calendar year, MicroStrategy only added 6,000 Bitcoin throughout those 4 months. He came out last month and bought 16,000 Bitcoin. So again, I think that's a very big sign that Michael Saylor is saying, look, the time is now. The time to accumulate a lot of Bitcoin is now. And you can see from this little chart I've pulled up, MicroStrategy has essentially been dollar cost averaging into Bitcoin. They've been buying nearly every month, and that is because they are a very profitable company. That again is a very important point that needs to be double clicked on very often, okay? The only reason MicroStrategy is able to do this is because they're a profitable company at the very beginning of things. Now, what's most interesting about MicroStrategy's Bitcoin playbook is the fact that not many other public companies have actually adopted a similar treasury management strategy that Michael has employed at MicroStrategy, especially when we consider the returns that it has generated for MicroStrategy. So this is a little chart here that Michael Saylor likes to take with him to all of his interviews with CNBC, and we can see here that it is measuring the performance of MicroStrategy against a number of different asset classes and things like gold and silver. And we can see here that MicroStrategy is up a whopping 271% since August 2020. Bitcoin is up 150% in the same time period. But then we can see on the right-hand side of this chart in red, assets like gold, silver, and bonds have all returned a negative return since August of 2020. So considering this amazing performance that Bitcoin has provided MicroStrategy, a lot of people have been confused. Why haven't we seen any other corporations try to emulate what Michael Saylor did for MicroStrategy? I mean, Michael even held an entire conference in early 2021 that he actually titled Bitcoin for Corporations, where over 1,000 corporations attended, and Michael essentially orange pilled them on what Bitcoin is and how they can actually implement a Bitcoin strategy for their corporation. But not many seem to actually take Michael's advice. Yes, sure, we had small examples like Tesla buying it for their balance sheet, and there has been a lot of talk that a lot of private companies have been quietly accumulating Bitcoin, but where's the public adoption of Bitcoin? Now, I think the biggest and the major hurdle to adoption for public companies has been the FASB accounting rules, okay? FASB came out and they actually said that public companies can now actually apply fair value accounting towards the Bitcoin on their balance sheet if they do actually hold it on their treasury. Before this recent rule change, it was actually very, very difficult for a public company to actually hold Bitcoin on its balance sheet because essentially, in a very simplified way of explaining it, every single time the price of Bitcoin went down, you had to mark that loss to your balance sheet. But every single time the price of Bitcoin went up, you weren't actually able to recognize that appreciation of Bitcoin as a win for your balance sheet. So this has made holding Bitcoin in the treasury for a public company very unappealing. But all of this is changing, which is going to make holding Bitcoin for public companies far more appealing. The rule actually goes into effect in 2025, but I believe public companies can actually adopt the rule earlier. So now we need to ask the question, what happens if we do start to see some public companies begin to adopt a Bitcoin standard? Well, let's have a look at how much cash these companies hold, because I think this is going to illustrate a very interesting picture for a supply suffocation in the future when more companies do the work like Michael Saylor has. So out of the S&P 500 companies, so these are the biggest and the best 500 companies in America, we can see that they hold $2.6 trillion of cash that Michael Saylor is actually saying is a melting ice cube. So let's run a little bit of an assumption. Let's say these companies want to be a little bit more conservative than Michael Saylor, and let's say they just want to put 10% of their balance sheets into Bitcoin, not the full-blown 100% that Michael Saylor is doing over at MicroStrategy. Let's have a look at these numbers so we can see that a 10% average allocation from all the 500 companies in the S&P 500, this would actually represent $260 billion of demand for Bitcoin. But the problem is, there's not that much Bitcoin sitting on exchanges currently available for sale. We can see here, there is only 2.3 million Bitcoin sitting on exchanges. Now, let's actually assume that these public companies are able to buy Bitcoin very quietly. Let's also assume the price of Bitcoin stays at $40,000. It doesn't move. And when we take a couple of those assumptions into our maths equation, we can see that based upon a $40,000 price tag per Bitcoin, and considering those 2.3 million coins on exchanges, an entity or these entities could buy all of the Bitcoin on exchanges for sale for $92 billion. Now, remember, for all of these companies to get a 10% allocation to Bitcoin, they would need $260 billion worth of Bitcoin. But at today's prices, there's simply not that amount of Bitcoin sitting on exchanges for sale. And while we are talking about the S&P 500 companies, I think it's really interesting to note what happened earlier in the week. Bitcoin actually breached the top 10 most valuable assets in the world. We can see it's number 9 on this list now, recently leapfrogging Meta. It is worth over $800 billion, and only 6 public companies and silver and gold are more valuable than Bitcoin. I think that's a pretty big milestone. Remember, there's over 50,000 public companies. Bitcoin's already in the top 10 most valuable assets in the world, and it is only 15 years old. Just a little sidebar I wanted to point your attention to that Bitcoin actually achieved earlier in the week, but let's run these numbers a little bit deeper. We also have over 2,000 billionaires who are going to need some sort of Bitcoin exposure in the world. And they too are going to be faced with the same maths equation facing these public companies. There is only 2.3 million Bitcoin on exchanges. And that means that if somebody wanted to buy the same amount of Bitcoin as Michael Saylor or more Bitcoin than Michael Saylor, there's only enough Bitcoin on exchanges for 13 entities to come in and get an allocation larger than Michael Saylor's. Now, let's actually assume some of these billionaires want to buy more Bitcoin than Michael Saylor. Let's assume they want to stay richer than Michael Saylor. And in a hypothetical world where the price of Bitcoin does continue to appreciate, all of a sudden Michael Saylor's net worth will continue to climb. And billionaires who have more fiat wealth than Michael Saylor, the only way that they will actually be able to stay richer than Michael Saylor is A, find an asset that's appreciating faster than Bitcoin, or B, accumulate more Bitcoin than Michael Saylor. So let's look at how many of these billionaires can actually do that, considering how many Bitcoin are available on exchanges today. Again, let's not forget the caveat. Obviously, the price of Bitcoin can rise very high, and some people could sell some Bitcoin on exchanges or move their Bitcoin to exchanges, and all of a sudden we do have more Bitcoin available for sale. But I would like to point your attention towards 2021. From the depths of Bitcoin's March 2020 crash, Bitcoin rallied from around 4,000 US dollars all the way up to $69,000 in the matter of 18 months. And how many Bitcoin were sent to exchanges to be sold? Only around 150,000, depending upon which exchange data you look at, which is not a whole lot of Bitcoin, okay? That's about how many Bitcoin that Michael Saylor holds. So this is showing us that we are actually living in a perpetual downtrend of people sending coins to exchanges. So again, let's just assume that there's 2.3 million Bitcoin on exchanges. How many billionaires can buy more Bitcoin than Michael Saylor? Well, we can see that there is only going to be 13 entities who can buy 170,000 Bitcoin like Michael Saylor. Now, some people might still scoff at that. They might say 13 people as crazy as Michael Saylor. That's never going to happen. Many people think that Michael Saylor is a very, very, very right end of the bell curve exception, and he could be, that's true. But I'd just like to remind you guys, there are many other billionaires who have a significant chunk of their net worth in Bitcoin. We have billionaires like Bill Miller. He's actually rumored to have a net worth somewhere around $2 billion. And he's been very public about the fact for a number of years now that he has more than 50% of his net worth stored into Bitcoin. So he has $1 billion worth of Bitcoin. Somebody else who has a large chunk of their net worth in Bitcoin is Mexico's second richest man, Ricardo Salinas. Now, the interesting thing I want to point out about this Mexican billionaire is the fact that his Bitcoin allocation has changed over time. It's changed quite a bit. We have an article here from 2020 that I want to point your attention towards. It is in November 2020, and he came out and he said he had 10% of his liquid net worth in Bitcoin. But then all of a sudden 2022 came along, and Ricardo Salinas now has more than 60% of his liquid net worth in Bitcoin. So I think it's really interesting to note how quickly things change for these billionaires. There only needs to be 13 billionaires who see the world like Michael Saylor or Ricardo Salinas or Bill Miller, and then decide to put a substantial amount of their net worth in Bitcoin. And all of a sudden, if we see 13 of these entities enter the Bitcoin space, there's no Bitcoin left on exchanges. Obvious caveats. Yes, they could buy some Bitcoin from the miners. This chart does show that the miners do hold over 1 million coins as well. But the point we're trying to illustrate here is the fact that Bitcoin is very, very scarce. And when demand for the asset rises, so will the price. And when the price of Bitcoin rises, I've done some maths here to have a look at what's going to happen to MicroStrategy and Michael Saylor. So today, MicroStrategy is a small tech company, okay? Yes, it's in the NASDAQ, but it is still worth less than $10 billion. But what happens in a hypothetical world where Bitcoin's worth, say, $500,000. Again, hypothetical scenario. We're not saying Bitcoin's going to $500,000 with any certainty. Let's just assume in the future that it does reach that price. This would actually mean that MicroStrategy would more than 10x if the price of Bitcoin went to $500,000. And again, for a little bit of fun, let's assume Bitcoin goes to $1 million. All of a sudden, MicroStrategy is going to be worth around $170 billion. And this fun little hypothetical scenario also doesn't include the fact that Michael Saylor is probably going to accumulate more Bitcoin for MicroStrategy, and they're probably going to hold more than 170,000 coins in the future. So in this hypothetical world of a $1 million Bitcoin, what does the world look like? Do nation states start accumulating Bitcoin? Well, it is going to be very interesting for MicroStrategy, because if you were to actually rank them as a nation, they would be the 21st largest nation in the world. So this is a really cool little chart here. It is measuring how much foreign reserves each country holds. And I'd like to point your attention towards Poland there at number 20. They hold around $180 billion in foreign reserves in their nation's treasury. And in a world of a $1 million Bitcoin, MicroStrategy would be just behind Poland there, sitting on a $170 billion Bitcoin stack if they don't buy any more Bitcoin. That again assumes that their treasury remains at around 170,000 Bitcoin where it is today. Now, what's really interesting to note about this hypothetical world where Bitcoin could be worth $1 million is that it would have actually flipped the world's longest serving store of value. Of course, we're talking about gold, the form of money that has been money for around 5,000 years. And what's really interesting is lots of people say that this is going to take a long time. A lot of people say that Bitcoin isn't going to flip gold for decades, but Adam Back is one of those people who doesn't actually think that's the case. Adam Back, the only person cited in Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper, actually believes that Bitcoin could flip gold this coming bull cycle. So if you want to learn a little bit more about why Bitcoin OG Adam Back believes that Bitcoin could flip gold in this upcoming 2024 Bitcoin halving cycle, you guys are in luck because we did recently film a video on this topic. If you want to watch that one, I'm going to put a link for that video on screen right there. And with all that said, let us know in the comments down below. What did you think of this one? Is Michael Saylor going to continue aggressively accumulating Bitcoin? We want to hear from you, so let us know down below. And with all that said, subscribe to the Bitcoin channel for more Bitcoin signal.